Let me begin by referring to something that I've already discussed. That is, if it is correct, as I believe it is, that a fundamental element of human nature is the need for creative work, for creative inquiry, for free creation without the arbitrary limiting effects of coercive institutions, then, of course, it will follow that a decent society should maximize the possibilities for this fundamental human characteristic to be realized. That means trying to overcome the elements of repression and oppression and destruction and coercion that exist in any existing society, ours, for example, as a historical residue. Now, a federated, decentralized system of free associations incorporating economic as well as social institutions would be what I refer to as anarcho-syndicalism, and it seems to me that it is the appropriate form of social organization for an advanced technological society in which human beings do not have to be forced into the position of tools, of cogs in a machine, in which the creative urge, that I think is intrinsic to human nature, will in fact be able to realize itself in whatever way it will. I don't know all the ways in which it will.
Welcome to the Sensible Socialist Podcast, a podcast for the rational left.
We need to unite and work together if we're all going to get through this. Sounds like socialism to me.
The amount of people I see talking about socialism positively is actually staggering.
Do you think, do you really think that a proletarian revolution is just around the corner in America?
Grab your pitchforks and stab your mayor.
Your hero, Obama.
Hey, he's not my hero.
How heroic he comes from.
If Bernie Sanders were president, right, and he wanted to bring the same ideas as for socialism into this country, do you think that would benefit?
Yeah.
But I just told you Venezuela's eating rats.
But I just want people to have health care. I don't want,
Same thing Hugo Chavez said.
Oh my god. You people have, worms in your brain, honestly.
All right, welcome to episode 29 of the Sensible Socialist Podcast. I'm your host, Kevin, and this week we're going to be talking about Libertarian Socialism, which I think for many people seems like a contradiction in terms, but we'll get there. But first, I was doing this before and I haven't done this recently, but I want to kind of get back into it. So I'm just going to kind of briefly review some of the newsworthy and noteworthy things that's happened over the last week and just kind of give my 2 cents on it, I suppose. So the first, not the first, but first thing I guess I'll talk about is obviously the government shutdown. That's the biggest thing that's happened, I think, since we've been off over the holidays. And so on the 21st, obviously the government shut down over the border wall. Obviously Trump had run saying that he was going to build a wall and that Mexico was going to pay for said wall. And of course, there's no obligation for Mexico to pay for a border wall that the United States government puts up on its side of the border. And so that was a fool's errand at the beginning, and it was sort of, I think, see-through for anybody who understands those kinds of things. But so I knew that Mexico wasn't going to pay for the wall. So either the U.S. taxpayers are going to pay for that wall, or it's not going to happen. And I think the Democratic Party has taken the line that they obviously don't want the wall, and they certainly don't want American taxpayers to have to pay for it. And so coming to an impasse, we don't have the funding to maintain the government. And so it shut down. And there's been meetings and different things basically every day. But just this week, after a meeting with Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who are the leading Democrats, Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker of the House again this week when the Democrats were sworn in and took control over the House of Representatives, and Chuck Schumer is the minority leader in the Senate. they have had discussions, but they leaked. Well, I guess they said what Trump said in the meeting, which was that this shutdown could go on for months or even years. The longest government shutdown before this one in the U.S. history is 21 days. That was in the 90s between the Republican Congress and Bill Clinton. But this is already, I think, the second longest. So if he's talking months or even years, that's obviously pretty unprecedented. Of course, everything with Donald Trump is unprecedented. So that's par for the course, I suppose. Another thing that happened this week, the New York Times attempted to do a hit piece on Bernie. There are apparently some people who worked for the campaign who have complaints about sexual harassment and things like that. And the piece does say that Bernie had no knowledge of it, or there's no evidence, at least, that he knew anything about it. And Bernie has said several times that he wants nothing to do with, anybody who has any kind of issues like that. And obviously these are not people in the highest echelons of the campaign, or certainly Bernie himself. Yet the New York Times basically made it seem like this was going to be an issue for Bernie in 2020. Now, Bernie hasn't technically announced that he's going to run, but I think everybody kind of thinks that he is. But it's essentially already bringing out the guns against Bernie. And so it's just something that we're going to see. But it's amazing to see such a bad job at it. I mean, the New York Times really did a bad job. It's just, it doesn't work. Anybody who's got any sense can see through that this is an issue for the people who have the issue, certainly, but it isn't an issue for Bernie in 2020. And so to make it that way is pretty obvious hit job. And the New York Times serves the purpose that it does, and you can go and check out our media episode, and we can talk about manufacturing consent and things like that. But it's not supposed to be so flagrantly, I don't know, ridiculous, I suppose is the right word. That piece this week, it's a lesson in how to do bad journalism. So another issue that happened this week that I thought was funny was Rashida Tlaib. I think how you say it. She is a new congresswoman from. I'm not sure where she's from, but I think she's from Illinois or something. But she said that I don't know if it's recently she said it, or if she said it a while ago and the video just emerged. But basically, there's a video of her saying about Trump that we're gonna go in and impeach the motherfucker, and that caused some controversy for some reason. I mean, Trump called China, he said we're those motherfuckers. So I don't see why it's such a big deal anyway. I don't care at all. What about the kids? Get over it. This is politics, right? I mean, I don't think a lot of kids are watching CNN, and if they are, they can, they could listen to some bad language. I think it's okay. And our politics has been too washed out for so long because of that kind of stuff, and not real and not representative of how people actually speak and how things are actually done. And I got to give Trump credit on to help tearing that down. He obviously doesn't have the most eloquent or foreshadowing kind of way of talking. He just shoots from the hip and goes, which isn't always bad. At least he, with him, he's a serial liar, and there's other things that don't help. But, I think just being able to speak plainly in how we actually talk to each other, which might be something like, I'm going to impeach the motherfucker, then we should be able to talk like that. And it's a fake outrage. But you have Nancy Pelosi saying, I don't like the language, and all that kind of stuff. Just ridiculous. The upcoming recession seems to be continuing to come. It's like waves lapping on the beach. The Wall Street has had obviously some tumultuous times. The shutdown does not help that at all. And included with that, this week, Apple released some, at least for investors, troubling news about revenue, mostly because the new iPhones are not selling like they used to. People aren't lining up for, around the block for the new iPhone. And partially it's because new iPhones are coming out really, there's like a year, every year there's a new iPhone, and people don't need a new phone every year. People are fixing their phones, and actually Apple admitted in the call with investors that it's essentially people not fixing their phone and not wanting to get a new one that is causing a slump in sales. So if you needed any proof that Apple is only making its products, not to last for them, they're not durable goods by any stretch of the imagination. And so they are trying to get you every way not to fix your phone, but to buy a new one because they need the sales. It's pretty ridiculous. In France, the yellow vests are still going strong. The protests are happening. There's been even attacks on some government buildings, and the police are still potentially, there's been a few instances of them actually donning blue vests and in some ways joining, which I think is obviously a good thing. In the Bolsonaro in Brazil took office this week, and one of the first things that he did was actually go after the sort of land policy regarding indigenous people. And so the bullshit in Brazil is starting already. One other thing about the back in America, for the 2020 Democratic race, it's pretty clear, I think, based on reporting and things like that Joe Biden is almost for sure going to run. He hasn't officially announced, but on January 1st, Elizabeth Warren announced that she's going to have an exploratory committee for the presidency, which really means that she's running. So Elizabeth Warren is running, and Bernie has not yet actually, like I said, officially said that he is, but everybody thinks that he is. And so there's questions about the difference between Warren and Bernie, and so it'll just keep getting more interesting. But I think that Elizabeth Warren, has her own problems, but as far as even comparing her to a Hillary Clinton or something like that, it's not too bad. I would take an Elizabeth Warren over a Hillary Clinton any day. It's not to say that she's perfect or that I don't have a problem with several of her positions. Namely the fact that she's essentially a capitalist. She wants to remake capitalism so that it has a nice smiley face. And best of luck to her doing that, but we've tried and it's not worked. So the last thing that was in the news this week that I thought was really interesting is not on Earth. The New Horizons space probe that went by Pluto is now out in the outer part of the solar system, and it did a flyby of an interesting asteroid, I suppose it is, an asteroid called Ultima Thule. And before we had just, gotten like 1 pixel images of the thing, and we weren't sure exactly what it looked like and some of its characteristics, but it got within 30,000 miles, I think, and we're able to take some much higher resolution images and found out it's a binary, like a fused binary. So 2 asteroids rammed into each other and basically were fused together. And so it's just kind of cool. And it's cool to know that that ship spent a lot of time going out for one flyby of Pluto, and but it's still doing stuff. And I think that's just a nice little lesson. So that's kind of the news. I thought that was interesting, and so I'll keep doing this if y'all think it's interesting, and just a way of kind of keeping up with what's going on. So all right, now we're on to the main event: Libertarian Socialism. All right, so I wanted to talk about libertarian socialism for 2 big reasons. The first one's pretty easy. I often identify myself as a libertarian socialist. I do so for a few different reasons, and I think partly it's to just spark conversation and to be able to talk to somebody about what those words actually mean. But the second reason I wanted to talk about libertarian socialism is because within the DSA, there is now a Libertarian Socialist caucus within inside. And so there's the Democratic Socialists of America are a multi-tendency organization, and so they have a lot of different people who kind of are part of that organization and come from a lot of different places. And so one of the things that they do say in the Who We Are, you can find this on the DSA, DSA-LLSC, the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, their .org, their website. But they say they take libertarian socialism to encompass those parts of the socialist movement, including syndicalists, council communists, anarchists, cooperativists, and municipalists, which have historically seen the surest path to socialism as residing in the creation of independent institutions in society that give the working class and ordinary people direct power over their lives. They go on, the Libertarian Socialist Caucus operates on 3 shared principles that they see as inseparable from libertarian socialism. That being freedom, which refers to the positive capacity of all individuals and community for self-determination. The solidarity, which refers to the understanding that all oppressed people, both economically exploited and politically marginalized, share a common struggle towards a free and equal society. And democracy, which refers to the collective decision-making free from hierarchy, domination, and coercion. And there's more at their website, and I think it's well worth looking at. But this is a growing thing in the largest socialist sort of organization in the country. And so I wanted to talk about what it would kind of mean and the way that I sort of look at that. And it's actually, honestly, it's pretty easy. The biggest issue, though, is in some ways just the definitions of the words. So what do we mean when we say libertarian socialist? And I think for a lot of people, especially people who would consider themselves libertarians, which usually means some kind of right-wing person, that this is a particular difficulty because it's something unique about the United States, that we talk about this differently than anybody else. And to give a bit of a background on that, I will give it to everyone's favorite libertarian socialist, Noam Chomsky.
Libertarian socialist was a contradiction in terms, given the meaning of the term libertarian in the United States. Well, you're right that the terms that I'm using are contradictory in the United States, but that's a sign of the perversity of American culture. Here, the term libertarian means the opposite of what it meant to everybody else all through history. So what I was describing was the real Adam Smith and the real Thomas Jefferson and so on, who were anti-capitalist and called for equality and thought that people shouldn't be subjected to wage labor because that's destructive of their humanity, and the real Adam Smith, who said that a government in any civilized society, something has to be done to prevent division of labor because it will turn people into creatures as stupid and as ignorant as it's possible for a human to be, and who advocated markets only on the grounds that under perfect liberty it would lead to perfect equality. Okay, that's the traditional libertarian tradition that I've been talking about, and in that sense, yeah, I'm a libertarian. The U.S. sense is quite different. Here, every word has taken on the opposite of its meaning elsewhere. So here, libertarian means extreme advocate of total tyranny. That's what libertarian means here. It means power ought to be given into the hands of private, unaccountable tyrannies, even worse than state tyrannies, because there the public has some kind of role. The corporate system, especially as it's evolved in the 20th century, is pure tyranny, completely unaccountable. You're inside one of these institutions, you take orders from above, you hand it down below. You're outside the institutions under what the libertarians want. There's nothing you can say. The tyrannies do what they feel like. They're global in scale. I mean, this is the extreme opposite of what's been called libertarian everywhere in the world since the Enlightenment. And that's what's called libertarian here. So yeah, it is hard to talk here because you can't use words like libertarian or conservative or anything because they've all come to take their opposite meaning.
So I think that's a really good way of kind of framing this, that you can be libertarian, and in fact, libertarian has always meant somebody on the left, somebody who, it's like anarchism, right? There's this whole growing thing of anarcho-capitalism. And they are contradictions in terms. An anarchist has always been a socialist. Just, every anarchist is a socialist, but not every socialist is an anarchist. And I think that the idea that, both libertarian and even anarchism has been co-opted by this like capitalist orthodoxy is really confusing and frustrating for me, because if we look at libertarian, obviously it comes from liberty, and there is no liberty in capitalist constructions. Now, what I mean by that is not in the theory of some kind of like perfectly functioning market that doesn't have any problems, that fulfills the ideology that a free market capitalist would say is sort of how the system works. If that were to be a system that would produce equality and genuine availability of opportunity for people and a standard of living that's very high, without the costs in human lives and in war and things like that, I'd maybe think that there was something to the idea that liberty really meant capitalist functions. But we've seen the course of history and of capitalism, and it's inextricably linked with the state. And so if you have a problem with the state, like Stefan Molyneux or somebody like that, then it's an expression of arbitrary power. But isn't the dynamics of a capitalist and a worker also in many ways an expression of arbitrary power? That sure, in principle, you could become a capitalist from being a worker, but just like in principle, you could become the president of the United States. Very few people actually achieve that because the barriers to doing so are so incredibly high. That same situation happens with in capitalism as it does in a state. So if you're anti-statist, it seems to me to only stand to reason that you would be anti-capitalist. So for me, I am against the state or expressions of arbitrary power. I think that those are just sort of obviously illegitimate because they are not based on some kind of consent or legitimacy coming from the population. And I think that's where legitimacy in terms of power comes from. You don't get legitimate power because you can beat the shit out of somebody. Like, you can get power that way, but that power isn't legitimate. And since our system, current system, and every state essentially rests on the ability for the state to use violence and to use it legally against you, it is quite obviously arbitrary. And I'm against that. And so I think that a person like me and somebody who is a person who would call themselves a libertarian in the meaning that most Americans mean, we would probably agree on the arbitrariness of power. The thing that in the hands of the state, the thing that I don't understand is why they don't see that in the hands of the capitalist. That's where I think ideology comes back into the game. And instead of talking about libertarianism and being the widespread suspicion of arbitrary power, it's really libertarianism as a guise for maintaining bourgeois hegemony over the economy, and by economy, the society. And so it's another expression of arbitrary power. And so that's why I'm a libertarian. I'm a libertarian because I think that the only way to get rid of the arbitrary role and power of the state is through genuine socialism. And for a lot of people, that is confusing because socialism is defined by many as the government takeover of the economy or the government owning the means of production. And I've explained it before how that's at least a misunderstanding, if not an outright falsehood. But the state obviously plays a role in the society right now, and it always plays the role of maintaining or supporting the ruling class in society. Right now, the ruling class is the bourgeoisie, and so the modern liberal democratic state serves the interest of that class. So obviously Marx argued and socialists will argue that the state has to be taken over by socialists, and the state then has to, work in the interests of the working class. That would, if the working class in power through its representatives in the state, then the state will use its power in the interests of the working class. Now, that's true, and that is a way that you would be able to begin the transition from a capitalist mode of production with a liberal democratic state structure system that supports it to a socialist economy where workers own the means of production, and the socialist state is the vehicle by which the sort of legitimacy of the power it has can express itself. The problem that there is, and I think, there's always been a tradition of the state withering away. That's always been a notion in Marxist and communist circles, that once the transition period from capitalism, to communism, to this classless society where there aren't workers and owners and there are just workers coming together and working together on their particular projects, then the state has no more role and sort of just withers away like an old leaf on a tree that isn't providing any life anymore. And while that seems plausible, the places that we've obviously seen attempts at creating socialism, at least at transitioning, granted many places that were not necessarily ripe for it, but that's a different discussion, you have not seen a decrease in the arbitrariness of the state's power or the resting of the state's ultimate ability to make decisions and enforce decisions by its ability to use violence, and sometimes fairly naked violence. And so I think that one thing that we really need to discuss, people on the left, is the genuine role of the state. How can we make limitations on the state so that it isn't just a mere expression of arbitrary power, but that it's something different, something more, something actually, not based on arbitrary violence, but based on something else. The natural question then is, if it's not based on that kind of arbitrary authority, what would it be based on? What would a libertarian socialist society look like? For that, I bring you Chomsky.
Well, within the main libertarian socialist and especially anarcho-syndicalist tradition, what's assumed is it should be a highly organized society. It should be based on popular control at every level. So begins with, for example, control by working people of whatever institution they're working in, factory, offices, whatever it might be, and control of communities. And then these should be integrated through voluntary association that could be regional. Then there should be federated structures that extend beyond and on to organization of international society. But it should be highly organized, though controlled from below, not anything complex is going to have some degree of representative decision-making, but always under direct control and recall and so on. So it's kind of a, sort of pure democracy, if you want. Mm. In fact, the example, it takes the major achievement of mainly anarcho-syndicalist development was libertarian Spain, and it didn't have a lot of time. It was wiped out pretty soon, but it was what developed rather quickly was a fairly organized society with a lot of interaction between agriculture and industry and communities and so on. Pretty successful economically, too. Well, core elements, first of all, would be authentic participation. That means everybody, not one person's a secretary, one person's a janitor, one person does the finance, and therefore you kind of automatically get a hierarchy of decision-making based on a role in the system. But really participating. That doesn't mean everybody can do everything. Like, I can't be a surgeon, somebody else can. But it means that in anything that involves decision-making functions, it should really be shared. It should be true in, say, universities like where I am, or publishing houses, or factories, or anywhere else. That's the beginning. And as soon as you do that, it just breaks down barriers among people. For one thing, it means, there is some kinds of work that nobody wants to do, but has to be done. Well, that has to be shared. If that's not shared, then you got a problem. But that can be instituted. A joint participation, decision-making can be instituted. If there is representation, immediate recall when under public, cooperative action. All of these things can be instituted on a very small scale and can spread to larger ones. And that, if it goes far enough, becomes a major organization.
Anarchism can be conceived as a kind of voluntary socialism, that is, a libertarian socialist or anarcho-syndicalist or a communist anarchist in the tradition of, say, Bakunin and Kropotkin and others, had in mind a highly organized form of society, but a society that was organized on the basis of organic units, organic communities, and generally they meant by that the workplace or the neighborhood or both. And from those two basic units involving the place where a person works and spends his creative energies and the place where he lives in relation to his neighbors and others around him, from those two basic units there could derive, through federal arrangements, a highly integrated kind of social organization, which might be national or even international in scope, where decisions could be made over a substantial range, but by delegates who are always part of the organic community from which they come and are returned to it and are revocable and in general would live there, in fact.
I think what's really important about thinking about this is, especially from an American point of view, just how American these ideas sound. So to me, the ideas of the American experience that I remember learning, in school are ideas of freedom, democracy, equality, justice, and for all equally. And I think that those are obviously ideals that we all want to live up to. And while we can obviously see where our society does not meet those, they are at least aspirational goals. And the language of libertarian socialism or anarcho-syndicalism or just anarchism is speaking that same kind of language. But it is recognizing that the system that we have created, despite our goals, have not been achieved. And whereas the power in the system could be based on genuine consent of the governed, it isn't, for a lot of reasons. And so to find a way of reclaiming that notion and reclaiming the legitimacy of the consent of the governed being the justification for the sovereignty of the state to act is sort of what we're talking about. Now, it isn't the interesting idea. Anarchism is obviously always seen as some kind of like chaos, it'll just be pure anarchy. And that obviously means pure chaos. But this is obviously a different notion of what the word anarchism really means. It's not, as Chomsky said, some kind of disorganization. It's actually highly organized, but it's organized based on not the principle of violence as the ultimate means of the authority, but as consent and participation as the basis of that authority. And I think that that's a system that isn't chaotic, but is actually highly organized and beneficial for the people inside of it. So it's strange to me that in the place like the United States that has at least these aspirational traditions, the ideas of libertarianism are not necessarily about participation or anything like that. They're simply getting the government off your back. And I am sympathetic to the government being on your back as, somebody who considers themselves a libertarian. Any ridiculous laws or expressions of arbitrary authority are things that I hate to see. But the idea that the arbitrary authority of Walmart is somehow different or better than the arbitrary authority of the state isn't clear to me. And I'm not sure that there actually is one. As Chomsky is well known to say, this idea of libertarianism being a pro-capitalist thing is actually not an idea of liberty, but actually of tyranny, and of the worst kind of tyranny. And that if you want to look at a place where you have, I mentioned this, my wife is from India, and when we were in India last, I want to take every free market, anti-regulation person to India, because it is obviously wildly unregulated, and there is dangerous things happening everywhere. People constantly get hurt. I saw people constructing a building without wearing shoes, without obviously wearing a hat, and who made their scaffolding out of tied together bamboo, and we're building a multi-story building. That is the kind of thing that you get if you have a market system that isn't regulated by arbitrary authority, because it's terrible, and it is a worse kind of tyranny than a regulated market. And what I am looking at, and what a libertarian socialist would propose, is to have every institution grounded in the legitimacy of it being from the people who are in the organization, that participation is widespread, the ability to recall the person who is making decisions, if they are empowered to do that, is absolute and always possible, that there are at the same time what I would call a principled democracy, that being a democracy that is based on the fact that you can't just will the basic rights of others away, and that you can't through legislation destroy the general welfare of the society. I think if you had those as two core principles that were inviolable, you could have pure democracy and be pretty safe. You would be able to deal with the issues discussed in the Federalist Papers, like the question of majority rule and minority rights, things like that. You can deal with those situations, and you could probably deal with them even better when they are closer to you, when you are part of the decision-making process of the societies, the organizations, the workplaces that you are actually part of and have a role in. So I think that it isn't a difficult idea, and it's actually, I think, something that's very digestible for most Americans. Libertarian socialism is the true expression of America's ideals. If we wanted to realize what Thomas Jefferson and some of those people were really talking about when they were using the language that they were using, we don't need to look at the history of the United States of America. That's a history of how you don't build that. What we need to look at is the history of libertarian socialism, anarcho-syndicalism, and anarchism. A final question, and I think that would be a legitimate one to look into, is, anarchism and this kind of like localized decision-making, things like that. That seems to make sense if you have small numbers of people, or, a limited kind of sphere, or maybe like a rural situation or a small community or something like that. But if you're talking about a highly advanced industrial society, you got to have the kind of state that we do have. There's a reason why we have the state that we do, because of the necessities of large-scale industrial and technological production. And so can this syndicalist or local pure democracy, or whatever you want to call it, is that actually possible in a highly advanced system? And to answer that question again, Noam Chomsky.
There has been an anarchist tradition, which was, and one might think, say, of Kropotkin as a representative, which had much of the character that you describe. On the other hand, there's another anarchist tradition that develops into anarcho-syndicalism, which simply regarded anarchist ideas as the proper mode of organization for a highly complex, advanced industrial society. And that tendency in anarchism merges, or at least interrelates very, very closely with a variety of left-wing Marxism, the kind that one finds in, say, the Council Communists that grew up in the Luxemburgian tradition and that is later represented by Marxist theorists like, say, Anton Pannekoek, and who developed a whole theory of workers' councils in industry and who was himself a scientist and astronomer, very much part of the industrial world of Dutch Marxists. Now, it's the latter. Now, so which of these two views is correct? I mean, is it necessary that anarchist concepts belong to the pre-industrial phase of human society, or is it the rational mode of organization for a highly advanced industrial society? Well, I myself believe the latter. That is, I think that industrialization and the advance of technology raises possibilities for self-management over a broad scale that simply didn't exist in an earlier period, and that, in fact, this is precisely the rational mode for an advanced and complex industrial society, one in which workers can very well become masters of their own immediate affairs, that is, direction of and control of the shop, but also can be in a position to make the major substantive decisions concerning the structure of the economy, concerning social institutions, concerning planning regionally and beyond, because they can have, in fact, objectively now, that is, technology permits and industrialization permits, institutions do not permit them to have control over the requisite information, the relevant training to understand these matters. A good deal can be automated. Much of the necessary work that is required to keep a decent level of social life going can be really consigned to machines, at least in principle, which means humans can be free to undertake the kind of creative work which may not have been possible objectively in early stages of the Industrial Revolution.
Now, I think this is actually very important, because as we look at what the technological revolution that we're going through right now is producing in terms of the change in the dynamics of labor and what labor is necessary and what isn't, and how much power there is in it. And I mean, it's shaking up even if you look at the labor theory of value, the idea of socially necessary labor time or power. I mean, how could you even measure that when you're talking about automated production and things like that? But if you're talking about the relationship between decision making and modern industrial production, what you see is that automation and those kinds of things free up our ability to participate more genuinely in decision-making process and the orientation of the production that doesn't necessarily demand human labor. But if we are not allowed to make decisions about what's done with and by automated labor, then our ability to direct that towards social need is extremely limited. And so without introducing more of these libertarian socialist principles into our society generally, so that the society can make the decisions that can orient production, especially automated production and technological production, towards the fulfillment of social need, then we're going to look at the kind of terrible, disorganized dystopia that many people think anarchism really is. It's a grand irony, but we actually need anarchism to save us from what people think anarchy is. The last thing that I want to mention or just sort of talk about is, I think there's a lot of people who, even on the left, who will be weary of anarchist ideas or this kind of libertarian bent, partially because it seems that to conflict with at least some basic parts of human societies, or dare I say human nature. And I don't mean this in terms of people are necessarily greedy and things like that. We could even agree that that's not the case. But there does seem to be a tendency for let's say, primates and apes particularly to be organized hierarchically and in some ways to maintain that authority through violence. And so there is some argument that this may be a natural kind of thing, and that human beings as part of the natural world and as animals will are sort of inherently or instinctively hierarchically organizing organisms. And obviously there's obviously a truth to that there has been a history of hierarchical organization, that we may do so in some kind of state of nature or something like that. But it is actually one of the sort of problems with doing evolutionary psychology all the time, or always putting human beings back on the Pleistocene, is that you have to take into account the progress that human beings have made since moving away from that and getting out of our instinctual and evolutionarily inherited characteristics. But I think that if you look at the modern society and you look at how human beings have organized themselves and can organize themselves, we already have good arguments for the reason why you have representative democracy or democracy. And that though the human beings may have been around for a couple 100,000 years, you don't get democratic institutions, at least in the Western world, until Greece, which is not that long ago in terms of the whole time span. So there's been progress in human thought and human organization and human production. And we are getting to a point where we need to encourage the human spirit to move beyond its heritage on the Pleistocene. Or we do carry it around with us. We have tribal tendencies. We have all these kinds of things, but we also have the tendency to cooperate, and we also have other aspects of our nature that we need to find institutions and mechanisms to encourage and really foist and make the most important thing, which it isn't in our society right now. It's about the attainment of things and the organization of status and all of and those kinds of things. And instead, what we need are institutions which bring us together and, in some ways, allow us to take advantage of our combined abilities and our ability to work together. Because when we look together, all we need to do is look out the window and see the world around us and realize these are the products of what human cooperation give. And what are the best mechanisms to enhance human cooperation? I very much believe that those are the ideas of representation, democracy, freedom, with the intent on equality and justice. All right, that is my Libertarian Socialism episode. Obviously, I owe quite a bit to Noam Chomsky, who was the kind of guy I used here for a sort of better talker than me on Libertarian Socialism. There are a number of different other commentators who are talking about Libertarian Socialism, but check out the Libertarian Socialist Caucus of DSA and check it out. It might be something you're into. All right. We got some interesting things planned in the next few weeks, so keep updated and check us out on social media. Just check out Sensible Socialist on your favorite social media platform, and you'll find it. All right. I'll see you next week. Later.